2013. This was the year the world learned a new name for terror. Out of the smoke of the Syrian civil war, a force emerged that redefined brutality. This was the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. History knows them as ISIS, ISIL, or Daesh. They did not just fight a war. They staged a campaign of systematic slaughter. Why did they grow so fast? It seemed impossible for a small militia to challenge nations. But they used a weapon more effective than bullets: pure, unadulterated fear. At first glance, they were just another rebel faction. In reality, they were a machine of genocide. Their methods were so extreme that even al-Qaeda disowned them. They revived practices from the Dark Ages: slavery, crucifixions, mass executions. For 10 years, thousands of civilians lived under a regime of blood. No one was safe. The group began in 1999. For years, they stayed in the background as a minor al-Qaeda affiliate. During the Iraq War, they nearly vanished. American forces and local militias killed their commanders and dismantled their cells. By 2008, the group was broken. Its own members called it an extraordinary crisis. They were on the verge of extinction. In 2110, everything changed. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi took command. He did not just lead, he rebuilt. He waited for the Syrian border to destabilize. When the civil war erupted, he sent thousands of fighters across the desert from Iraq. His goal was absolute: a caliphate governed by Sharia law with himself as the supreme ruler. The footage from this era shows a rapid expansion. ISIS fighters moved in convoys of black flag trucks. By 2014, they reached their peak. They controlled 100,000 square kilometers of territory. This area covered 30% of Syria and 40% of Iraq. It was a state the size of Iceland or Tennessee. But how did they defeat standing armies? The answer is visible in the desertions. Thousands of uniformed soldiers dropped their rifles and fled. They stripped off their uniforms and changed into civilian clothes to hide. They knew the reputation of ISIS. Capture meant a slow, public death. The group didn't just win battles, they broke the will of their enemies before the first shot. In the frame, we see the city of Raqqa. This became their capital. From here, they commanded 80,000 soldiers by August 2014. They fought everyone. They attacked the Syrian government, the Kurds, the Free Syrian Army, and Hezbollah. They had no allies, they only had targets. The caliphate officially fell in 2017. Pro-democratic forces retook the strongholds of Mosul and Raqqa. The black flags were torn down and burned. The physical state was gone, but the ideology remained in the ruins. Events accelerated, but the threat shifted. The story did not end with the fall of a city. ISIS moved into the shadow. Wahhabism. This extreme form of Sunni Islam drove every action of the Islamic State. The core doctrine demanded a total cleansing of the faith. It required the purging of any group that supposedly defiled the religion with false teachings. To the leaders of ISIS, these were not just disagreements. They were seen as moral failures that required a violent response. Why did they seek total war? The group was an apocalyptic sect. They believed the end of the world was approaching. In their vision, the end times would arrive only after ISIS defeated the enemies of Islam. They aimed to re-establish the Rashidun Caliphate. This was the original Islamic State formed immediately after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. Blood was the currency of their ideology. The group glorified murder. They taught that killing apostates and heretics was the most direct path to paradise. It wasn't just a strategy, it was a religious requirement. Anyone who refused this strict ideology became a target. They were viewed as vermin. The command was simple: extermination. While the group heavily persecuted Christians and Yazidis, they reserved a particular hatred for Shia Muslims. ISIS saw the Shia as a group that perverted and desecrated the true faith. The law of the land was a brutal interpretation of Sharia. The footage from the time shows the reality of this rule. Under this system, slavery was legalized for specific classes of people. Women lost all basic rights. They became the legal property of their husbands. A woman could not walk the streets alone. Domestic abuse was legal and protected by the state. Divorce was impossible for women to obtain. The legal system focused on physical mutilation. If a person was convicted of stealing, the state amputated their hand. The punishments grew more theatrical and cruel. The camera records the results: public crucifixions, beheadings, and prisoners burned alive in cages. Even the streets were policed for morality. This was the job of the Al-Qansa Brigade. It was an all-women unit. They patrolled public spaces to enforce strict dress codes. They watched every movement. A woman could be arrested for wearing makeup. She could be detained for wearing a robe that was too tight. Even failing to act meekly in front of an official led to imprisonment. The brigade ensured no woman was in public without a male chaperone. The violence was so extreme that it created a rift in the global jihadist movement. Even other terrorist organizations were repulsed. Al-Qaeda, a group responsible for thousands of deaths, publicly distanced itself from the Islamic State. The leader of Al-Qaeda issued a statement. He claimed the actions of ISIS went too far. He argued that the blood of women, children, and even non-combatant Shia was protected. He stated they were excused for their ignorance and should not be slaughtered. But ISIS ignored the warnings. The killing continued. There was no turning back. Thus, the caliphate became a factory of death. June 2014. The borders of Syria and Iraq vanished as a new power rose. Why did ISIS target everyone? At first glance, it was a war for territory. But in reality, it was a systematic campaign of biological and cultural erasure. The list of victims was long. Yazidis, Mandeans, Assyrians, Turkmen, Druze. ISIS fighters did not just occupy land, they sorted the population. Men were marked for the grave, women were marked for the market. This was not random violence, it was a business model. The caliphate revived the mechanics of 18th century chattel slavery. They didn't just capture women, they codified them as property. The sound of auctions filled the squares. Human beings were inspected like livestock. Documents prove this. In 2014, an official ISIS price list surfaced. It was a verified administrative document. It broke down the cost of human life by age and religion. A woman between 40 and 50 years old cost $43. A girl under the age of 9 was the most expensive. Her price was $172. The bureaucracy of evil was efficient. But for the Yazidi people, it was total. Why were the Yazidis chosen for destruction? ISIS viewed their ancient religion as devil worship. This label stripped them of all legal protection. In the eyes of the caliphate, they were not people of the book. They were heretics. The assault on the Sinjar region was a slaughter. The footage shows the results. Entire villages were emptied of men. Some were lined up and shot into trenches. Others faced slower deaths. The camera records victims being burned alive, decapitated, or buried in mass graves while still breathing. August 3, 2014, the Sinjar province fell. In every town, the numbers rose. Tens, hundreds, thousands. ISIS filmed the executions in high definition to use as recruitment tools. Betrayal came from within. For decades, Yazidis and Sunni Muslims lived as neighbors. But when the black flags arrived, the dynamic shifted. Local Sunnis pointed out the homes of Yazidi families. They tricked them into staying until the traps were set. 50,000 people fled into the Sinjar Mountains. They were trapped on the bare rock. No food, no water, no medicine. Below them, ISIS militants advanced. The sound of artillery shells hitting the slopes was constant. The choice was simple: convert to Sunni Islam or die. Unlike Christians, the Yazidis were not allowed to pay a tax to survive. They were to be eradicated. But the mountains did not become a tomb. Kurdish forces moved in. British and American jets began airstrikes. Cargo planes dropped crates of supplies onto the peaks. The siege broke, but the cost was astronomical. Thousands were already gone. Then, ISIS turned its sights on the Turkmen. The Turkmen were mostly Sunni Muslims. By ISIS logic, they should have been safe. They were not. ISIS viewed them as a fifth column, traitors with ethnic ties to Turkey. June 2014. The city of Tal Afar fell. 300 Turkmen were executed immediately. 1,300 were abducted. Only 42 ever returned. By September, 350,000 Turkmen were in flight. By the next February, that number hit 600,000. 600 Turkmen women were forced into the slave trade. They were moved in trucks from Iraq to specialized female prisons in Syria. There, they were distributed to fighters as wives or shared among militants as property. Most have never returned to their ancestral homes. The minorities did not wait for rescue. They formed militias. The Sinjar resistance units, the Nineveh Plains forces, the Turkmen brigades. The footage shows the reality. They were outnumbered and outgunned. They carried old rifles and lacked heavy armor. Alone, they were holding back a tide. It was only when they joined the Kurdish Peshmerga that the front line stabilized. Events accelerated toward a final confrontation. Without the eventual collapse of the caliphate, these groups would have ceased to exist. Their history would have been erased. Their people would have been property. Thus ended the era of the auctions. 2014. The Islamic State declares its borders. No foreign government recognizes the map, but on the ground, the reality is different. ISIS operates as a functioning state. This means they must manage a grid. They need electricity. They need water distribution. They need a construction industry. They need to manufacture weapons and provide basic health care. Most importantly, they must pay their soldiers and administrators. A stable income was mandatory. Where did the money come from? It was a mix of oil, narcotics, and foreign donations. But their primary tool was taxation. Every subject paid. Non-combatants paid zakat based on their total assets. Merchants paid ushur, a tariff on every crate imported or exported. Even the soldiers were not exempt. They paid khums. This was a 20% cut of all war booty. If a fighter took a car or a television, the state took its share. But the state was also a criminal syndicate. They practiced systemic extortion. Shopkeepers received a choice: pay a protection fee or watch the building burn. Banks were emptied. Jewelry stores were looted. The video evidence shows empty vaults and shattered glass. These were not just acts of war. They were business transactions. The black liquid was the lifeblood: oil. ISIS controlled the wells and sold the crude domestically and on the international black market. They didn't refine it themselves. They sold the raw product directly at the pump to independent local traders. These middlemen took the crude to private refineries. The result was either petrol or mazout. Mazout is a thick, low-quality fuel oil. It burns black. It fills the air with toxic soot. The refineries were primitive. In the footage, you see steel tanks turned into furnaces. There are no computer controls, only a bonfire lit underneath the metal. The process is simple distillation. Heat the oil. Let the vapor travel through overhead pipes. Let it cool and drip into plastic-lined trenches. It is crude. It is efficient. It is lethal. The waste was the real killer. A thick, cancerous sludge solidified at the bottom of the tanks. It had to be scraped out by hand. Who did this work? Children. Teenage boys were used because their small bodies could fit through the hatches. They climbed into the darkness with shovels. Every second was a gamble. The tanks frequently exploded. If the fire didn't kill the workers, the air did. Oily soot coated every surface. Oil spills turned the soil into a black swamp. Workers spent 12 hours a day inhaling chemical fumes. One worker summarized the situation in a single sentence. He called it a slow suicide to feed his children. The machine kept running on blood and oil. There was no other way. 4,500 oil wells. This was the industrial foundation of the Islamic State. British, American, and Syrian jets targeted these fields daily. The goal was to destroy the infrastructure. But the money kept flowing. Turkey, Iran, Jordan, and Iraq served as the primary destinations for the crude. This was a black market on a global scale. How did they move illegal oil across borders? The process required deception. Smugglers sold the oil at massive discounts. This made the risk profitable for international buyers. One method involved mixing. Legitimate traders bought the ISIS oil and blended it with legal supplies. The origin disappeared. Other loads crossed into Turkey by truck. Drivers moved under the cover of night. Once across, the oil entered refineries or was pumped into tankers alongside legal shipments. A former intelligence officer under Saddam Hussein detailed the profit margins. One truck carried 28 tons of oil. The purchase price was $4,200. In Jordan, that same load sold for $15,000. Even enemies became customers. The United States issued formal accusations against the Syrian Assad regime. They claimed the government bought oil from the very group trying to overthrow it. At the height of the caliphate, the numbers were staggering. Production generated $1 million every 24 hours. Some intelligence reports placed that figure at $3 million per day. Oil was the beating heart of the organization. Because of this, the refineries became high-priority targets. Heavy bombers and drones struck the facilities around the clock. By the end of 2015, the strategy worked. Daily income plummeted from over $1 million to $660,000. The money dried up as territories were liberated. ISIS lost thousands of wells and control over fertilizer and cement plants. Their tax base vanished as civilians fled. The group needed a new revenue stream. They found it in narcotics. Phenethylene was the chosen product. Known globally as Captagon, this stimulant became the drug of choice in the Gulf states. It served two purposes. First, it provided massive profits. Second, it fueled the soldiers. The drug suppressed hunger and eliminated fear. It allowed fighters to stay awake for days. Islamic law strictly prohibits intoxicants. ISIS ignored this. They manufactured the drug in hidden labs and distributed it to their ranks. In North Africa, affiliated groups took different roles. They trafficked cannabis and hashish. They provided armed escorts for international drug cartels. The scale rivaled the world's most powerful syndicates. In 2020, Italian police made a discovery. They seized 14 tons of Captagon produced in Syria. The shipment contained 84 million tablets. Its street value was $1 billion. It was the largest amphetamine seizure in history. But drugs were not the only alternative. Antiques became the second largest source of income. At one point, ISIS occupied 30% of Iraq's historic sites. They seized ancient cities in Syria. They followed a dual strategy. Large statues were smashed for propaganda. Smaller, portable artifacts were looted for the market. One man stood in their way. Khaled al-Assad was a prominent Syrian archaeologist. As ISIS approached the city of Palmyra, al-Assad took action. He loaded the most valuable artifacts into trucks and moved them to secret locations. He refused to let history be sold. The militants captured him. They held the 82-year-old man in a cell for 1 week. The footage shows the ruins of the city where he was interrogated. They used torture to find the hidden treasures. Al-Assad did not speak. The end was public. The militants murdered the archaeologist and hung his body in the city square. A placard was placed around his neck, labeling him an apostate. He died to protect the past. Thus ended the reign of the desert's most profitable insurgency. December 2017. This was the date the caliphate broke. After years of urban warfare and thousands of casualties, Iraqi forces cleared the final districts. Every city, every checkpoint, and every oil field once held by ISIS returned to government control. The black flags came down. By early 2029, the territory had shrunk to a single point on the map, al-Baghdadi. This was a small village in eastern Syria, tucked against the Euphrates River. It was the last stand. The Syrian Democratic Forces began their final assault on February 9th. They moved house to house, clearing tunnels and trenches. By the end of the operation, the physical caliphate was gone. But did the threat vanish? In reality, only the borders disappeared. ISIS still exists as a functional network. The organization pivoted from a state to a shadow insurgency. Many regional factions remain active across the globe. Some groups have pledged formal allegiance to the core leadership. In Mali, Nigeria, and Somalia, these affiliates still hold physical ground. They collect taxes, run checkpoints, and enforce their own laws. Other cells hold no land at all. They operate from basement apartments and encrypted chat rooms. These groups focus entirely on hit-and-run tactics against soft targets. There is also a third tier, the digital recruits. These are individuals radicalized through screens. They never meet a handler. They never travel to a training camp, but they carry out killings in the name of the group. The footage shows the scale of the reach. In 29 countries, the logo appeared after the carnage. The geography spans from London to Mumbai and from Sydney to Mindanao. It is a global franchise of violence. March 22, 24, Moscow. 4 gunmen entered a concert hall. They carried automatic rifles and incendiary devices. 144 people died. 551 were injured. The attackers filmed the massacre on body cameras. The video proves a single fact. The group retains the logistics, the weapons, and the will to strike major capitals. The caliphate lost its map, but it kept its blade. The war shifted from the desert to the streets.